Say I took the name in vain. I don't even know the name, but if I did, what really was it to you? There's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter what you've heard. The holy or the broken. Hallelujah. I did my best, it wasn't much. I couldn't feel, so I tried to touch. I told the truth, I didn't come to fool you. And even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of song with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah.
The powerful presentation you just witnessed was by the Urban Assembly's School of Performing Arts. And I had to pause. It's not the first time I've heard this song, but it moves every time. I heard that performance. It's not the first time, but I'm still moved. The Urban Assembly is committed to ensuring the social and economic mobility of students by advancing capacity to enhance student achievement, well-being, and for opportunities post-secondary education in all 23 of its schools. They currently serve over 9,000 students in small subject-themed public, middle, and high schools across New York City, including 7 career and technical schools and 3 all-girls schools. What I did not tell you is that the School of Performing Arts intentionally selects students who were denied entry by what we call the top, otherwise would be considered the premier performing arts schools in New York. We invited David Adams, who is the CEO of Urban Assembly, to give us a look in. David unfortunately got called away for military service, but what he's done is sent us a short video because he desperately wanted to be part of what we are doing here today. Mr. David Adams.
20 years ago, in the Bronx borough of New York City, an idea was born. With a citywide graduation rate of 49% and community members pleading for an education system that did more than just sort the wheat from the chaff, the Urban Assembly came into being with a mandate to improve public education. During this time, and still in New York City today, the most popular approaches to school improvement had little to do with teaching and learning, but invested instead in drawing students already likely to succeed back to the public school system. Under the guise of parental choice, schools began to screen out students starting in high schools, then moving down to middle schools. Attendance, grades, essays, interviews were all employed, until instead of students picking schools to serve the public good, the the schools instead were rewarded for picking students that served their metrics. The Urban Assembly chose a different path, participating in the breakdown of large high schools that were only graduating 1 out of every 2 students and invested in structures that led to the improvement of public schools in New York City. Every child was known, their strengths, their challenges, their motivations. Schools were unscreened, open to all students should they choose us, a reflection of our faith in teaching and learning. Social and emotional learning, career pathways, industry partners, and a culture of assessment that helped students and teachers understand the current skills and chart a path towards developing them. These were our investments. These were our bets. These are the hallmark of the Urban Assembly, and this is what it means to be an Urban Assembly school. The video you saw was of students at the Urban Assembly School for the Performing Arts, the only unscreened performing arts school in New York City. 1,800 schools. Their talent is undeniable. The purpose of Urban Assembly schools is to grow the talent of our youth, to hold ourselves accountable, not for who our students are coming into our schools, but who they are when they leave. What they know, what they do with that knowledge, the whole person. I encourage the leaders here gathered here today to join us on this journey. Grow your students. Find your schools who embody this ethos, lift them up. Schools who pride themselves on creating the largest difference between the incoming and outgoing proficiencies. Lift them up. Schools who recognize that all learning is social and emotional and invest in the whole child. Lift them up. Schools like the Urban Assembly School for the Performing Arts, whose students recently participate in a congressional briefing to the 117th Congress on the importance of an education that sees the person behind the students and grows them both, lifts them up. If you join me on this journey, the benefits to your countries will be immense. Adults contributing their full potential to their communities. Children recognizing that their talents, no matter how currently underrealized, are essential to the forward movement of society. And educators recognizing that there's a child out there right now waiting for you to see them for who they truly are. Thank you to 6 Seconds and CARICOM for inviting me here today. Thank you to the educators and audience for all you do on behalf of our young people in our communities. And a special shout out for those whom growth was always the goal. Until the day where every school invests in every student, we will stay the course and we will succeed.
Sharon?
Yes. To take your questions about SEL, student engagement, and development from the Urban Assembly perspective, we have with us Mr. Brandon Frame and Ms. Khandra Knowles. Welcome, you two. Brandon Frame is the director of SEL at the Urban Assembly, where he leads a team and portfolio of schools to build the capacity of the staff in implementing and sustaining SEL. Under his tenure as a leader of the UA's Resilient Scholars Program, participating schools saw dramatic reductions in suspensions and improvements in school culture, and the program expanded nationally to states like Texas, Virginia, and California. Brandon is also co-founder of the award-winning Twitter chat #HipHop and the author of Define Yourselves, Redefine the World, a guided journal for boys and men of color, and the children's book, My First Tie. Khandra Knowles pursued her master's in social work from New York University and has been a licensed social worker in the state of New York for the past 6 years. Khandra is completing a doctoral degree from Fordham University in social work and partners with the Urban Assembly in New York City for research on social emotional learning in New York public schools. Her experience spans from working with children in foster care in upstate New York to providing mental health support to women and girls who are survivors of sexual trauma in the Bahamas. Most recently, her work has been with educators and parents in the Bahamas to create programs and provide support focused on the acquisition of SEL skills for students to improve academic achievement. Welcome, Brandon and Khandra, to our summit. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Truly honored to be here. That was a great video by David, and we're looking forward to answering questions and talking all about social emotional learning, because that's what we live and breathe every single day. And we know that all learning is social and emotional. So,
Thank you. So participants, Here is your opportunity to have a conversation with Brandon and Kendra. You can use the chat or raise your hand to ask questions. While you are getting your questions in order, let me start the ball rolling with my own question. So, Brandon, how would you describe your experiences in creating or holding the space for the successes that have been described by David?
I think one thing that's really important is we really work with schools around implementation of social emotional learning. So I think the challenge that people are facing is that people will find and look for a curriculum when they're thinking about doing social emotional learning. They may even go look for an assessment. But then the question is, how do you make sure that it lives within your building in every single space? Oftentimes, SEL sits with maybe the school counselor or the psychiatrist, but it has to live and breathe with every teacher, every administrator. It has to live with support staff. And so it's thinking about that implementation. And that's what we do with our schools. And we have an SEL team. We're asking, what are the communication channels? How are we communicating SEL to parents and what we're doing and how they can continue that work at home? And so the Resilient Scholars program is really around a guided implementation model to help schools organize themselves around the principles of social emotional learning. I've been on for about 20, 30 minutes now and listening to some of the conversation. And we know that all our schools are centered around academic development. Every single school that I would go to in the world is centered around academic development. But the question is our school centered around academic and social emotional development? And that's what we're really looking at with our schools and making sure that SEL is the core of the essence of the building and that everything lives and breathes that from instructional strategies to extracurricular activities.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat. How do you implement SEL within schools? What's the process?
So the process, yes, absolutely. So we have a theory of action, and then I'll also let Kendra share as well. But the theory of action that we have is called Scan, Plan, Act, right? And so the first step of that process is to scan our communities. So let's first take a look at our instructional strategies. Let's look at our social emotional supports. Let's look at our behavior supports. Let's look at our extracurricular activities and align them to social emotional learning competencies and indicators. So if we're looking at turn-in talks, how does turn-in talks actually activate social emotional learning skills and making sure that teachers are explicit about that? All right, from once we scan our community and we see all the inputs, then we can move into a planning phase and think about what are all the questions that we need to ask ourselves if we're going to implement social emotional learning with fidelity. And then lastly, we have to think about sustainability and thinking about turnover is real. I know here you can have a school with 50 teachers one year, and then the next year you have 25 new ones because 25 left. So we have to ensure sustainability by collecting artifacts and collecting the way that we do things and making sure that no matter what leadership is in the building, no matter what teachers are in the building, that work will maintain and be consistent over time. And so that's kind of our Scan, Plan, Act theory of action that we share with teachers and principals and school districts as they look to organize themselves around social emotional learning.
Thank you.
I'd add to just on that sustainability portion is that the buy-in is a really strong part of that foundation to implementation. So in terms of adults in the space, educators, administrators, there has to be a buy-in. That need has to be seen first before any type of process even can be put into place and be effectively sustained.
Okay. Rolly, I see. Thank you very much, Kendra and Brandon. I think Rolly has a question.
Hi. I'm hearing and I'm receiving all that was said there, but I believe a critical element that not enough discussion is being had is the element of the home, the parents. And even though I'm at university level, sometimes I get some pre-adults, that 17, 16-year-old coming in, and they are not emotionally stable, they are not mature. Where in this big puzzle does the home, the family, the parents, the aunts, the extended family fit in? Because really that's their first support base. And I want to understand, I want to be able to incorporate, I want the know-how on how we can marry and have a good harmonious relationship, including family with the school administrators and teachers. What's the role of the PTA here?
Yeah, so I want to start, and then Khandra can definitely. She's a part of our family engagement activities within our schools as well. So one thing that we do within our implementation plan that we work with schools on, the first thing is just to ask, how are you going to engage parents? So like one thing that we're really big on is helping schools think through it. So what you just asked is like, when they're doing implementation, there's so many different questions that they think about, and sometimes you actually just, even as a school, you just forget, okay, we're implementing social emotional learning, how are we going to engage parents with that? So first thing is to think about it. What does that look like for your school? Because every school looks different in terms of their approach and teaching and learning. So we want to first ask, like, how are we going to do that? And then I'm going to let Khandra share a little bit of what some of that actually looks like.
So that was a great question. That is something that a lot of work is being done around, but part of supporting schools with engaging parents is also to make sure that the PTA, which you mentioned, is part of the work. And so once the PTA is on board and teachers are on board, then there can be an active move towards implementing something that includes both the home and the school environment. So family engagement is just one of those tools. And oftentimes when we equip schools to be able to effectively engage parents and family, then you will see SEL be something that is across the board. So it isn't just pocketed as a curriculum, but it is pocketed as a way of being for us to holistically develop together.
Great. Are there any more questions in the chat?
Yeah, there's several in
Yes,
the
definitely,
yeah.
Heather Phillip Boyce, she
Yep.
asked, how do you convince the administrator in the school that SEL is important when the students and parents are academics oriented?
I love that question. And so the first thing that we start with is that, one, all learning is social and emotional. So when we're having conversations with principals, we're starting there. Learning math, emotional learning is already happening. What's not happening is that it's not explicit. So when we're looking at the instructional strategies, and to answer this question, I'm sitting with principals and saying, how are your teachers activating social emotional learning skills in their pedagogy? Now, because it's not about making SEL necessarily like this priority, it's more in your lesson plan. And as you design this one lesson, how are you making sure self-awareness or social awareness, self-management is coming alive? An ELA class, how are you designing lessons? So if you're reading a book, some of the questions to say, how has main character developed social management or self-awareness throughout this book or throughout this chapter, right? And so that's integrating social emotional learning into the actual work that's happening. It might be sometimes a little challenge to create an advisory and get the curriculum, but we can make sure that SEL lives and breathes in every space, and it is incorporated in everything that we do, particularly those instructional strategies, which we know when we're able to work with teachers in that way, that's going to raise academic achievement, because when that student can activate social emotional learning skills to learn the content, they get mastery, and then they're ultimately going to be more successful. So that's the approach that we do take when having that conversation around making it a priority, but more so, how does it look prioritizing it? One way can be implementing it into instructional strategies, which people are already doing, but it's not explicit. We're not letting students, I have one video where a young man is saying, I didn't know that I was learning social emotional learning skills till you told me I was learning social emotional skills. So by making it explicit, the student is picking up on, while I'm learning math, I'm also building my self-awareness or self-management skills.
And cool. I take it one step further too, Ms. Hall. And so for me, as someone that's been a guidance counselor in schools too, one thing I do share with administrators that are very academic oriented or focused is that there are so many things happening in the lives of our students outside the classroom. So yes, SEL within the instructional realm, but the magnitude of what they're dealing with in terms of the home and divorce and peer pressure and drugs and sex, and it's happening so much younger. If there is not a focus on social emotional learning, self-awareness, they struggle with even being present to learn that content. And so that is one avenue to really have administrators understand that their presence is not even going to be effective if all the other things outside the classroom is still not being addressed.
So many great questions. So many great questions. And we're running out of time.
I know.
But I just go ahead.
Oh yeah, I
Just
see a few
quickly.
more.
There's one of the boys.
Yeah, I want to try to get. I want to try to get both of these questions in one. So
Yes, those are the last two that you'll take.
I'm gonna start with Marcia. So before we activate SEL with students, teachers need to activate it for themselves. How do we help teachers cope, deal with SEL skills? So I'm actually dropping a link in the chat. This is a resource for all of you to have. When you click on this link, what you're going to see is SEL, the competencies, and you're also going to see the indicators. And when you look at those indicators and you look at 1A, 2A, 3A, you're going to see the indicator there for students, but you're also going to see what adults should be doing. And so to answer this question, that's the work that we do with our teachers, is looking at how are you modeling the behavior, and then what steps do we need to take to build that, so that now this is what we want students to do. How are you looking at it for yourself, and what behaviors should you as a teacher be doing? And a lot of times, again, these things are happening. That's one of the biggest things around buy-in, is making sure that people see that they've already been doing it. We're just trying to make it explicit so that people are aware. And to the other question, which is, our boys are often less willing to respond emotionally. How do we engage our boys emotionally where it can positively impact learning? I think one is being at a tier 1 level where all social emotional learning is being done for all students. A lot of times when we go into schools at the start, a lot of stuff is targeted or tertiary. So it's just for this small group of students. It's for behavior issues, right? And then it's for, your one-on-one students. How are we making sure that social emotional learning is at the universal level, that all students have access to it? That's one. And then from there, you can make targeted supports, like a boys program that the boys take part in, or a mentoring program, which then enhances that. And there's certain things that just happen in single gendered settings that you can't get in a co-ed setting. But we have to think about how are we making sure universal supports are consistently happening across the school to help our boys see that it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to ask for help, because those are tied to those indicators, and we need our boys to embrace every single one of those indicators, but we have to make sure it's universal and not seem like it's a targeted approach.
Yes, thank you so much, Brandon. There have been such great questions. I'm sorry to have to end this session. There have been so many great questions here, but thank you for sharing this space. Remember to check the link, the chat for the link that Brandon is going to post. And I want to share one comment with you, a quotation that David he spoke in his speech, and it really struck me. And it said, "We hold ourselves accountable, not for who our students are when they come into our schools, but who they are when they leave." David Adams, Wisdom, CEO, Urban Assembly. Thank you so much, guys.
No, thank you so much for having us. I look forward to this when it's in person, because we will absolutely be there. I just want to